We're up in the stem here of Arabella, and we are making some sawn frames. And the reason we're doing some sawn frames up here is there's a lot of shape and twist, and to put that twist in the bent frames is a little challenging. And the other reason is that up here they're so short and they're so straight that in a lot of ways it's just easier to saw them. So we've got one sawn frame here that's almost done in, and we've got 2 more to make. So we can pop this one out and kind of show you what this looks like and what we did to it, and then we can get to work making the other 2. Here is what 1/2 of these sawn frames looks like. All right. So this bevel here matches the angle of the stem. This wing comes down on the side of the stem and comes down to the bearding line, which is the top edge of the rabbit. And then this is that bevel that you're talking about that we have to put into it. So if we were to bend these frames, we would need to put that much twist into them, which is a lot. And when you do that, they tend to kind of lean forward in the stem and lean aft in the stern. It can keep the spacing to be a little challenging. And since, as you can see, they're really short and they're relatively straight, we can saw them out of a single piece of timber, which is really easy. If we couldn't saw them out of a single piece of timber, we would do what's called double sawn frames. And if you want to check that out, there's a chap on the West Coast by the name of Leo, and he's restoring a boat called Tally Ho. I believe his project is Samson Boat Company. And his boat is nothing but sawn frames. So if you want to check out what double sawn looks like, he can show you how. But since we're just doing them in the stem and stern, single sawn is all we're going to be doing. So we just pick up these patterns off of the ribbons and the rest of the boat here, and then go find some appropriate stock, cut them out, shape them, and fit them. And these will eventually get joined together with a bronze floor that'll get bolted down into the stem. And then when we put the planking on, they'll just get screwed into these, and we won't use the copper rivets. Since these are so much deeper and have more meat to them, and they're not split like the bent frames, putting screw fastenings in them is very appropriate. So yeah, let's put this away and show you how we make them. The first step in getting the sawn frames made was to hang these ribbons. So these ribbons are 1 1/4 inches thick, which is the same thickness as our planking, and we put a long skinny feather end on the end. And the reason is that these molds are made to the inside of planking, the rabbet is the outside of planking, and the bearding line is to the inside of planking. So to find all of these, we kind of need to know where the planking is going to land. So by having that thin feather edge, we can put that right on the outside rabbet line, and with relative accuracy, be able to extrapolate the inside line and figure out where that bearding line is. So that's what I did here, is I took just the thin rule and put it behind it and slid it out until I hit the timber. And then when I hit the timber, I just made a little mark, and I did that for each of these ribbons going up the stem. And then once those marks were made, I just unscrewed these and sprung them out a little bit. And then down here, we have the bearding line that we already put in and the rabbet line. So I just put some tacks at the bearding line here, and where I marked these points, sprung a batten, ran the Sharpie down it, and that gave us the bearding line. So now when we do the sawn frames, we know that the outside edge of that sawn frame needs to come down and hit this bearding line, and that's why we needed to find it. Because if we made it to the rabbet line, we would be all messed up, and we would have to carve that way back. And then the other thing is, once we go to cut the rabbet, we already have the bearding line marked. So we know that we're removing between these two, and we can start to put in the battens and the fids and kind of fair those in and true them up as we go. So if we go on to the other side, we can run through this process, and you can see exactly what I'm blathering about. Now that we've got the bearding line marked, we can pop out these nails and take these battens off, screw the ribbons back in, and we're set to start picking up the patterns for the frame. Now, I trust this mark that we put in fairly well, but these ribbons with the feather edge, especially putting the twist in them, it's hard to get it exactly where you want it to be on the rabbit line. And this batten also has been used a bunch and broken and is now a little on the short side. So when we go to cut in the rabbit, we're not going to treat this line as pure gospel, but we're going to treat it as a really good reference mark. So as we put in the sawn frames, we're leaving everything just ever so slightly fat. And then once we start to come up here with the planking, we can just put a batten on there and fair in and just trim back the frames a little bit, clean up the rabbit a little bit. Especially since we haven't done this before and there's so much shape and twist going on up forward that it's really easy to grab the adze or grab the chisel and take something off a little bit later. It is a lot harder to add something later. So we're just leaving everything a little proud, but we're just kind of roughing it in, getting like 80% of the way there so that when we get up here with planking, any of that final tweaking as the police see how the planks go on and how everything wants to lay, will be really easy. It won't take a lot of time or effort, but we are not trying to bring all of this down to 100% at this point. So, you know, marking it with a Sharpie is perfectly adequate. So let's pop this off, spring these ribbons back in, and move on to the next step. Now that we've got the bearding line marked on both sides, we plop this board here, and this is just kind of giving us a reference of where the sawn frame is going to land that we just made. And now we want to fill in the space between that frame and the stem. So all of the frames in the boat are 1 foot down center from stem to stern. But now that we're in the very stem, and we're going to do the same thing in the very stern, we're a little less concerned about 1 foot on center and more concerned about just spacing them evenly in this short little space that we have. So if they're 11 inches on center or 13 inches on center, it doesn't really matter. We're just trying to get them so that they're evenly spaced. So what we're going to do now is just kind of pick a spot here. So we'll put the nail out of the way. Put this ruler here on the rabbit line. And then I think we want to come somewhere right around here. So we'll mark that at 15 inches. We'll do the same thing on the other side. So we want the center of the frame to land at these 15-inch marks that we just made. And we're going to put on this 1.5-inch thick board. And we're going to put some markers out on it, which will make sense in a second. So to account for this and make sure that we land up centered where we want to be, we got to pull this board about 1/4 inch forward of where our marks are. All right, and that should land the frame right at the center. So we can clamp those down. Okay, so now this vertical board is just going to get clamped in here. Since these ribbons kind of slope up to the shear, when we clamp this board on, it makes this one come down at a pretty steep angle. So what we want to do is get this vertical. So we'll put a level on here. We can just tuck a shim in the back. Just a smidge bit more. So now we have this vertical post exactly where we want this frame to end up being. And now we just need to mark where each of these ribbons are, down to the bearding line and down to the stem. And we're going to do that with the air nailer and some little wooden pointers we made. So now what we're trying to do here is get the exact shape at each of these ribbons. So we're going to use these little plywood pointers. And we're just going to run them out until we touch. I'll just take a couple brads and tack them in. And where these are, how up, high, crazy, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that this point is against the ribbon. We're gonna do the same thing going on down. So now we have the location of each of these ribbons as well as where it's gonna land on the stem. Now the next thing we need to pick up is how far down from the stem it is to the bearding line. And we also need to go through and pick up all of these bevels. So just gonna tuck that in there, and then all we're gonna do is just trace that. We also want to mark the height of the shear. Since this ribbon is a little bit below this one's actually marking the shear. And that is almost 2 inches up. So we'll just say the shear is 2 inches up. And we'll mark this point when we spring the batten later on, but we'll just know that we need to make sure that it extends at least 2 inches above this so that we can have enough room to include the shear. We don't want to end the frame too early. All right, and then the last measurement we need to grab is from the tip of this straight down to the bearding line. So let me hop out of the boat and get that. So 3 1/4 inches. I'm just gonna make note of that. And that should give us all the measurements that we need. We can pop this out and transfer that to some cardboard or plywood, whatever you want to use for the template. In our case, we're going to use cardboard. Before we take the pattern out of the boat, I want to do a little marking on the cardboard here. So that patterns, eventually it's going to be split into 2 pieces that have to meet in the middle on the stem. And I want the split in the cardboard here to be that middle. And I know that the stem is 6 inches wide and that the bearding line is 3 1/4 inches down from that. So I can draw the stem in on here and get the stem centered. And that way when we put the pattern down on it, we can just line that up exactly where it needs to be using the pointers. And then that'll make sure that this split is right exactly in the middle of those frames when we go to pick out timber and cut it. Because the last thing we want to do is have one like taped tiny little strip on the edge there to make up the difference if we don't get it centered perfectly. All right, so that is basically our stem, and we want the bottom pointers to come right at the 2 tips here, and then that will be where our bearding line is down the side of it. So now we can grab the pattern and pop that on here. last thing we need to do is measure port and starboard. So now we have our port and our starboard patterns. So this here is going to get cut out, and that is where the stem sits. And these nibs are going to come down to where the bearding line is. And this square here is a 5-inch tall piece of timber that we want to use to join the two of these. So that's where the bronze floor will end up landing. And then these are our two wings. And for now, we just made them 3 or 4 inches thick. I forget what I set the dividers to. Because after we put the bevel on them, we can see what they look like. And we always have the option of throwing these on the bandsaw and just cutting the inner line a little bit deeper if we want to make them thinner and lighter. But for now, we'll leave them a little on the chunky side because that inner line doesn't really matter. Now we'll just cut them out, and then we can take these patterns outside and go see if we can find some timber to fit. So when we were looking for stock for our bent frames, we wanted nice straight grain stock because we were cutting these basically skinny little pieces out of it, and we didn't want any grain run out. So this kind of squirrely, wild grained timber that we have here was no good for that. But this is perfect timber for making sawn frames. And when we harvested all the timber, we knew that there could be a chance of us making some sawn frames in the stem and stern and possibly doing some timber knees. So we wanted to make sure that we had some options of some good sweeps and some crazy shapes. So when we cut these logs, normally a sawyer would cut it down here and you would take off this big bulge on the end because it makes moving them around in the woods and putting them on and off the sawmill more challenging. And for conventional lumber, this is useless anyways, so just cut it off and leave it in the woods. But for us or anybody else who is going to be doing boat building or doing sawn frames, you need to have those sweeps and those curves. So we tried to make sure that we had those when we cut the timber. So if you put the pattern on here, the grain follows the shape of this pretty well. And that is exactly what we're looking for with sawn frames. So if we put this on a piece of very straight timber, and this one isn't too bad because it's relatively straight, and you ended up with grain that ran the short ways through it like that, it could end up breaking really easily. So having that grain that follows the curve and the sweep is ideal. So we're just gonna rough out some patterns here, knock them down to size with the chainsaw and bring them in the boathouse and bring them down further with the bandsaw and then the thickness planer. We brought these big chunks into the boathouse and we just ripped them through the bandsaw, and you can see we cut pretty wide of the line here. And now we're gonna run them through the thickness planer because right now they're almost 3 inches thick and we wanna bring them down to 2.5. And by cutting everything wide, we can plane them down, take out any irregularities, and when we cut them through with the bandsaw, again, we'll have a nice flat face. We'll make sure that it's 90 degrees and we'll have pieces that are very close to fitting. After that, we'll just have to cut the bevels. So we'll run these through the thickness planer and bring them down to 2.5, which will be their final thickness. If our bandsaw was an actual ship saw, the table would stay flat and the head and the blade would tilt. But it's just a normal gigantic bandsaw. So the head stays stationary and the table is what tilts. So it's not really ideal for cutting compound changing bevels. So we're gonna have to cut those on these frames by hand. If we had an actual ship saw, we could just, when we picked up the bevels, we could figure out exactly what degrees that was. And then when we cut the outside edge, we could do it on the bandsaw and tilt the head and run it through and cut the bevel. But since we don't have that, we'll do it by hand. So the first step for us is going to be just to mark where each of these pointers hit. And then we'll square those down. And now, flip them over. So I've got port over here, starboard over here. And then we can pick up these bevels and transfer those to the faces here. Transfer that. If we pin the rule underneath, so I got the 10-inch mark here to make it easy, and then we put our bevel gauge set to it. So we are 1.5 inches. Since this is the forward face, come in 1.5 inches. And that is the bevel that we're going to have to cut. So we're going to have to connect from that dot out to this outside edge here. And we'll pick that up again for here, and then we can spring a batten in there, cut the arc, and then that'll show us where we need to cut and what material we need to move, and that'll get us really close so that we can pop them back in the boat and do the final fairing when we put some ribbons around while they're mounted into the boat. But this will get us very, very close. So now that we got our points marked, we can go through and spring a batten here. And now, since we're only springing between 2 points, I'm just going to pull on the middle here a little bit until we start to see that arc. And then we'll cut to that. And like I said before, right now we're just trying to get them close. So if we're not exactly on point, it's okay. Now we just need to connect the dots. So from this line to this outer edge, and from this edge out to here. And if we cut all that out, these should slide in there between the ribbons and be relatively close. We'll have to do some final shaping on the nibs here and where they meet, maybe tweak the angles a little bit. These will definitely need a little bit of work, but we'll be somewhere between 70 and 80% of the way to a finished frame, which is all we're really trying to do with these. So if you take these over to the bench and clamp them into the vise, we can go through with the saw and kerf them and just knock all that material out. Quick pass with the power plane, and we can see how they fit. Hey, it's such a better job cutting to the line when there's no camera around. Hey, crikey, it's almost like we made it to fit. Yeah, so that's what we're going for. Actually, almost seems like I know what I was doing. So here's the first rough fit of the very bow sawn frame. So it came out fairly well. We've got a little bit of adjustment to do on the bottom angle here, as well as the wings to close this gap up. But for a first fit, this is about as close as we ever expected or hoped to get, really. So the next step's just going to be pulling some measurements and bringing it on the boat and off the boat and back and forth and doing some of the final fits and tweaks until we get it a little bit closer. And then we'll probably make some bronze floors for it, get it installed, and like I said before, do the final fairing and shaping on the outside once it's installed and in place.